Hello and welcome to this ETOA Snapshot session. I'm Rachel Reed and I'm joined by David Edwards, our resident tourism stats expert. Today, we are going to discuss quantifying the value of tourism to the economy. Now, David, this is clearly a very important topic, but there are some diverse approaches to this, aren't there?
There are indeed, Rachel, that is right. And we are going to start by talking about the World Travel and Tourism Council's approach. And they produce a whole array of fact sheets. And they do that annually for world regions and indeed for individual countries. And at the moment, the latest Europe analysis details performance for 2020 alongside 2019 data for comparison. And we can be expecting the 2021 fact sheets to be out fairly soon. Now, it is estimated that the total contribution of travel and tourism to GDP in Europe fell from 9.5% in 2019 to 4.9% in 2020. In absolute terms, that means that the value of travel and tourism to GDP in Europe fell from 2,191 billion US dollars in 2019 to 1,065 billion US dollars in 2020. The total contribution of travel and tourism to employment in Europe is estimated to have fallen from 38.5 million jobs to 34.9 million, or a 10.1% share, falling to a 9.3% share. Now, these fact sheets follow a template, and it's very useful that this template also includes data on things such as the proportion of visitor spend that is domestic versus international. And as we can see here, for Europe, 66% of visitor spend in 2019 was domestic. And it's also annotating the proportion of visitor spend that is for leisure versus business. And we can see that 80% of spend was on leisure travel in 2019. Now, the UNWTO also put out a whole array of information on the value of tourism. They're very supportive of countries adopting the tourism satellite account approach for measuring the value of tourism. In addition, data to support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is collated by UNWTO. The focus is often on what is called tourism direct GDP as a share of total GDP. And then this is a rather narrower overall figure than WTTC will look at, where they include things such as indirect and induced impacts from travel and tourism. Now, the UNWTO data is available at country level, and it can be downloaded in a time series basis. However, this tends to be for countries rather than for geographies such as Europe. At the Europe level, published UNWTO figures tend to be restricted to international tourism arrivals and international tourism receipts. What are the latest estimates? Well, in 2020, these were thought to be around 744 million arrivals international and 576 billion US dollars worth of spending respectively. So a few points to ponder then for our little discussion. Having an agreed definition of which nations constitute Europe and what it is that constitutes tourism is the first hurdle to overcome in describing the value of tourism to Europe. Second point is it more impactful to cite the share of GDP or employment accounted for by tourism than the absolute numbers? So earlier on, I was talking about figures such as $2,100 billion, and in a sense, that number is very difficult to comprehend. Third point and final point is, should the sector find better ways of describing its value than relying solely on economic metrics? For example, its value to local communities, to personal well-being of those taking a trip, and even as a tool for protecting culture, heritage, and indeed the wider environment. So 3 points to ponder there, Rachel.
Indeed, thank you very much, David. In fact, the one that stuck out for me was your middle point there about how do we make these figures impactful? And obviously you gave some extremely large numbers from some of the reports from UNWTO and WTTC. And, you know, to me, it seems that those are just massive numbers. And, you know, when you go above a certain billion, it doesn't really resonate with people. And I think that the stats that show the share of GDP or employment are much easier to comprehend for people. And I think why I like those as well is it enables you to place tourism's value alongside other industries like telecommunications, etc. So there's no point saying there are 8 billion tourists and 85 million mobile phones. I mean, that's not a comparison at all. So, I mean, I certainly think that the impactful thing is to show it as a percentage of GDP.
Indeed, I think it's a way of getting both those who are very much involved in the industry, but also those crucial stakeholders who can influence the industry, namely those who make policy, to really get a grasp. Because in a sense, as you rightly say, when a number gets so big, it loses its meaningfulness, and talking about the shares is really very helpful as a way of comparing and contrasting the relative importance of the sector.
Yes, and I think also, perhaps thinking about how this links up to the first point as well, is this idea that, you know, you're counting often one person visiting multiple times, and we're not able to get that down to unique people. It's just instances of visits, which again can be very, some countries have many short-term visitors. Say, for example, Belgians going to France, not necessarily for work, but visiting for tourism, but, you know, very great number of those. You know, and I think that does sort of muddy the waters a little bit. But I mean, absolutely, this idea that tourism actually means different things to different people. And certainly as well, getting anything at the European level is very tricky because it requires so much collaboration between so many countries. And we're not even sure how many of those we should even be asking.
That's absolutely right. And what is quite helpful about the WTTC fact sheets that they put out is that you can download them for different definitions of Europe. So you can download an EU or a Europe, but you're quite right that people are unsure. Well, even geographically, when you talk about the continent of Europe, oh, well, how far west do you go? Do you include Iceland? How far east do you go? Do you include Turkey, for example? So it's a really tricky definition to think, well, what do I mean by Europe?
And indeed, it does partly depend on political agendas. Say, for example, were this being done in Greece, they may well include Turkey. If it's being done in Norway, you know, perhaps not so much. It does often depend on the political environment as well.
Indeed.
I think just moving on to the last point before we finish, David, I really like this idea of describing tourism's value in more than just economic metrics in terms of, you know, local communities and well-being, protecting culture, etc. And I think it's a very interesting thing for people to tackle. And in fact, we do have a report on our Insight Hub done in the Netherlands, which is the Dutch report on societal value for tourism and recreation. We're just showing you the Insight Hub there, etoa.org/insight. You can find that report from the Dutch there. But my final point, David, was that I think it's a really interesting way of looking at the wider benefits of tourism, not just how much money and how many people it employs.
Absolutely. I think the sector has to find ways of engaging with people in general, as well as key politicians and policymakers. And we need perhaps to think and find creative ways of moving beyond just talking about really big numbers and talking about perhaps some of the softer, but just as important ways in which tourism can benefit local communities and is a way of providing funds for protecting heritage, for protecting culture. And I know we often talk about the damage that tourism might cause to the environment, but also it can be used for good in terms of protecting the environment. So it's, I think, a challenge for the wider sector to find a way of describing all the benefits that it can bring.
Absolutely, David, and I really look forward to seeing more of those kind of metrics in the future. Do please look up any of those reports. The two that David mentioned from WTTC and UNWTO are on our Insight Hub as well. And David and I look forward to seeing you on another snapshot. Goodbye.